Now, we've repeatedly talked about the race for Africa. We've talked about China, Russia and the US and how these countries are vying for influence there. But we rarely talk about Japan, and there's a reason for that. Since the Second World War, Japan has shelved its global ambitions. It is not interested in spheres of influence or foreign interventions. But Africa is an exception. Starting the 1990s, Japan has been focusing on African countries. Their preferred tool is the TICAD, the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. Think of it as a donor conference. The first edition was held in 1993. The latest one was held last week. It was hosted by Tunisia. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was expected to attend in person, but unfortunately he contracted the Wuhan virus, so he ended up attending virtually. Kishida promised both political and financial support for Africa. He pledged $30 billion over the next 3 years.
Japan will invest a total of $30 billion in aid for development in Africa over the next 3 years in public and private sectors. First, specifically, we will promote the growth of green energy. We will launch the Green Growth Initiative in Africa and invest $4 billion in public and private sectors.
This money will be split into different avenues. $1 billion is earmarked for debt consolidation reform, $300 million to boost food production and $100 million just for Tunisia, the host nation. Now, these are investments and aid. They're not secretive loans like China's. And that's one reason why Africa positively views Japan's leadership. Their projects focus on human development, on things like health and education, food production, green energy, disease prevention, something the president of Senegal also pointed out.
Almost 30 years after its launch, the Tokyo Conference for African Development continues to deliver on its promises with solid results in the areas of education and training, agriculture, health and water, to name but a few.
Compare that to China, investment-heavy white elephant, secretive loans and debt traps. That's what China gives you. More and more countries have begun realizing this. They're seeking safer alternatives to China, and that's where Japan figures. Their policy was perfectly summed up by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He said Africa is no longer an aid recipient, it's a partner for growth. Naturally, African nations appreciate that sentiment. Abe's successors have carried that policy forward, including Fumio Kishida. Let me quote from what he said last week. Japan reiterates its determination to redress the historical injustice against Africa of not being represented through a permanent membership on the Security Council. Again, an important commitment. Japan wants to put an African nation on the United Nations Security Council. It wants Africa to be on the high table of diplomacy. The question is, what's in it for them? As they say, there are no free lunches. So what is Japan getting in return? For starters, economic gains. Africa is home to 30% of all mineral reserves. It is also an emerging market for commodities, and Japan has an eye on both of them. In 2015, their total trade with Africa was around $24 billion. Compare that to China. China's trade with Africa is almost $254 billion. So Japan has a lot of catching up to do here. The second reason is political. Africa is home to 54 countries put together. That's a powerful voting bloc at the United Nations. It's also a divided bloc. Most African nations have refused to take sides in global conflicts, and that includes the war in Ukraine. Japan and the West are hoping to change that. They want Africa's support against Russia and China. Indications are there is progress. Let me quote from the Japan-Africa Joint Declaration. We take good note of the initiative for a free and open Indo-Pacific as announced by Japan at the 6th Donor Conference in Kenya. And that's one part. It also talks about Russia's war. We express serious concern about the situation in Ukraine and its impact on African and global economies. For neutral countries, that's saying a lot. I'm not saying African nations will dump China overnight and embrace the West. I'm saying Africa is looking for good bets. Like all countries, they want safe and transparent deals. It doesn't matter if it comes from China or America or Japan, which is why Africa is the next battleground. India too should take note of this conference. The last India-Africa Forum was held in 2015. Another edition was slated for 2020, but it was postponed indefinitely. Maybe it's time to revisit India's stalled African outreach. After all, countering China is not just a Western strategy. It is in India's interest too. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.